Do you ever pick up books on a whim? I do, and in this video I talk about some of the books that I picked up when knowing little or nothing about them. Today on Rogers Reads. Hey everybody! For those of you new around here, my name is Roger and welcome to my channel, Rogers Reads. So today I'm going to talk about books that I picked up on a whim, usually knowing little or nothing about it. Often I'll be browsing in my library, for instance, and I'll see a cover that catches my eye. I'll read the synopsis and it sounds interesting, so I take it home. Other times I purchase or borrow books only after I've done an incredible amount of research into the book. So this is a video about those books that I bought on a whim. And as always, I put a link to all the books mentioned in the description below. So the first book that I want to talk about is Goodnight Boy by Nikki Sheehan. So I was browsing the young adult section at my local library when this book caught my eye. So I knew absolutely nothing about this book. I've never heard of it. But the description of the back cover really piqued my interest. So the entire story takes place in a kennel where a teenage boy named JC has been locked in along with his dog Boy by his stepfather. So the entire story revolves around JC's storytelling as he recounts his life story to the dog, to Boy. We eventually learn the reason how JC and Boy ended up in their current predicament. According to JC, he did a bad thing that upset his stepfather so much that he ended up locking JC and Boy away in the kennel. So what's interesting about this story is that there was almost no dialogue throughout the entire book. All of it was portrayed through JC's thoughts and his one-way discourse to Boy, all of which worked really well in the story. Now, the lack of two-way dialogue here didn't mean that the book was difficult to read. On the contrary, the author's clever use of white space, in which some pages only contained a sentence or two, made the book not only readable, but added extra intrigue and emotion that kept you turning the page. So though heartbreaking in places, Goodnight Boy is a beautiful, moving and hopeful story of an abused boy, his dog, and their journey toward freedom. Now, I would give a trigger warning with this book as it does contain scenes of child and animal abuse and neglect. So next up is Being Henry David by Kel Arnested. So I stumbled across this book on a booktuber's blog, and I thought the premise sounded really intriguing since I've always enjoyed reading Thoreau. So it wasn't quite on a whim, but I didn't really do any research on the book. This person talked about it briefly, so I immediately requested it from my library. So the story begins when a teenage boy finds himself in Penn Station in New York with no recollection of who he is, and he has a nasty bump on his head. His only possession is a beat-up paperback copy of the book Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So shortly thereafter, he comes into contact with two homeless kids. When they ask him his name, he tells them it's Henry David, which they then shorten to Hank. Remember, at this point, he has no idea what his real name is. And at this point, he wasn't comfortable telling anybody about his amnesia, especially strangers. So of course we wonder right from the beginning, what could have happened to him to have caused his injuries and his amnesia? And what's interesting about this story is that one of Hank's biggest fears through all of this is discovering that he might be a monster, and he fears that he's a terrible person who's done horrible things to others. So because of this and his not knowing, he attempts to keep the new people in his life really at an arm's length, not daring to get too close to anyone. So the entire part of the book pretty much revolves around the mystery of Hank finding out who he really is, and at some point his old world and his new world collide. So so this was a very enjoyable read. Next book is, where are you? Number 3, Jack of Hearts and Other Parts by L.C. Rosen. And I just did a full-on review of this book on this channel. So if I remember, I'll put a card up below. But if not, there'll be a link in the description. So Jack of Hearts and Other Parts. So this is a sex-positive story that follows 17-year-old Jack Rothman, an out and proud high school boy who authors a sex advice column in his friend's online zine. So Jack begins receiving anonymous notes in his locker, the first being something like, I think you're cute. So Jack's not sure whether to consider them flattering or creepy. But then the notes take a major turn for the stalkerish. Now, if you don't like to read about sex in your novels, especially your young adult novels, then you'll probably want to pass on this one because Jack talks about sex quite openly. This is a novel that's definitely not for the prudish. But all in all, I thought that the novel Jack of Hearts and Other Parts is an incredible read in which our main character has to decide whether to stay true to his authentic self or give in to the demands of a stalker. So in this way, the author kind of combines the YA contemporary genre with a dark mystery thriller, and I really ended up enjoying the result. So the next book on my list is Anna Dressed in Blood by Kendara Blake. So with this book, it was the cover that attracted my attention, and I was delighted to learn when I read the blurb that it was about a ghost hunter named Cass Lowood who travels the country with his witchy mom as they follow local legends and local lore about evil ghosts that harm people. And when they find the ghosts, Cass destroys them with his ghost-killing knife. But then, Cass encounters a ghost the likes of which he's never come across before. A ghost that the locals call Anna Dressed in Blood, who is entangled in curses and rage. And we learn that since her death, Anna has killed every single person who has dared to step into the deserted Victorian house she used to call home. So, Cass decides to hunt her, and the fun begins. So yeah, I really ended up loving this novel, as well as the sequel to the novel. So the next book I got on a whim is entitled The Finder by J.E. Loren. So this book was on sale, and since the blurb sounded interesting, I decided to give it a chance, and I'm so glad I did. I actually got it in ebook format. So this one is kind of a gay romance novel with a serial killer twist. So this follows our main character, Augie, who can hear the voices of victims who call out to him, often begging him to find them. The kicker is that the victims can be either dead or alive. Thus, Augie is able to find the bodies of murder victims, so he's become quite a valuable asset to the police department. So Luke, one of the police officers with whom Augie works, is determined to bring Augie out of his shell. And eventually their friendship deepens and heads towards the romance territory. Now, many of the recent bodies that Augie has found are victims of a recent serial killer who is targeting young gay men who seem to resemble Augie in appearance. So things get especially dire for our main character once he becomes the main focus of the serial killer, and he ends up being the one who needs to be found. So all in all, this is an enjoyable, well-written book with a gripping storyline, and this is one of those stories that kept me thinking about it for several days after I completed the book. So the next story on my list is The Golem and the Jinni by Helen Wecker. So in this story, we have a blend of Arab and Jewish mythology and folklore, resulting in a truly mesmerizing historical fantasy. So the story begins when a golem, which is a creature of Jewish folklore that's made of clay, ends up alone in New York, masterless and frightened. Now, luckily, a local rabbi catches sight of her and recognizes her for what she is. So he offers to help her integrate into this strange new society. New for her, that is, given that she's only been alive for a couple of days. So the second creature in our story is a Jinni, a creature of Arabic folklore, which is more commonly known as a jinn, D-J-I-N, or a genie. So the Jinni is a creature of fire and was born in the ancient Sumerian desert over 1,000 years ago. So in this story, he's accidentally released from a flask by a tinsmith. So one night, the golem and the Jinni haphazardly meet, and an unlikely friendship develops between the two of them. But then a more powerful evil, the villain of our story, arrives in town, and we learn that he is someone who links the two of them together, and his arrival threatens both the golem and the Jinni's existence. So I thought that this was a wonderfully rich and fascinating story of mythical creatures, old magicians, and ancient cultures that was all brought together in a marvelous conclusion. So next up on my list is Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. So this is the first book in the Raven Cycle series, and this was another book that was on display at my library, and the cover caught my attention. So for a while I was really into books about psychics, so when I read the blurb, it caught my attention and begged me to take it home. So the story follows Blue Sargent, a daughter in the family of psychics, who ends up becoming friends with some of the boys from the Aglionby, I think it was the Aglionby school, which is a private school. So she's especially drawn to one particular boy, Gainsey, in a way that she can't entirely explain. Now, Gainsey's on a quest to discover the whereabouts of a long-dead Welsh king, and all sorts of interesting things occur during their quest. And it's also worth mentioning that Blue here has been warned pretty much her entire life that she will end up causing her true love to die. Now, she's never believed in love anyway in the first place, so she never thought that this would ever be a problem. But now it seems as though she's developing feelings for Gainsey. So yeah, I ended up reading all 4 of these books in the series, and I ended up loving it. And you know, I got these 4 books from the library, but it's definitely a series I would love to read again, so I think at some point I'm going to try to pick them up and reread the series. Because I wouldn't mind having a copy of those books on my shelves. So next up is Storm by Bridget Kemmerer. So this was another book whose cover caught my eye at the library, and once I read the blurb and saw that it was about 4 brothers who have magic, I was hooked. So Storm is the first book in the Elemental series in which a girl named Becca Chandler stumbles into the dangerous and adventuresome world of 4 brothers, each of whom possesses an elemental power. So it all starts out when she saves Chris Merrick from a fight in the school parking lot, and soon thereafter she learns that he can control water, just like his brothers can control fire, wind, and earth. So each of the brothers, they're powerful and dangerous, and there's someone who wants all of them dead. And now that Becca knows the truth about them, her life is in danger as well. So yeah, I read the entire series. I actually pulled the books right here, and I always love the covers of these books. But she did come out with new covers for all of these a few years back, and I think this book might be one of the new covers. But yeah, so I read this entire series and I really enjoyed it. And you know, it's It's another one I wouldn't mind rereading because it's been many years since I've read them. So maybe I will do reread them on this channel and do a little book chat about each one. But anyway, enough digression. Let's get back to books I read in a whim. So next up is Undead and Unwed, which is a Queen Betsy novel written by Mary Janice Davidson. So this is the first book in the series, and this was a free ebook one day a while back, so I decided to check it out, and it ended up being a lot of fun. So it follows Betsy Taylor, who loses her job, and then she's killed in a car accident. But Betsy does not stay dead, and to her utter disbelief, she is now a vampire. But as she soon learns, she's a little bit different than other vampires. In fact, her new vampire friends are convinced that Betsy is the prophesied vampire queen. And now they want her help in overthrowing the most dangerous and power-hungry vampire in 5 centuries. There's also a fun romance in this book, but I'm not going to say anything about it because that was part of the fun of this novel, discovering how it all starts out. But I will say that this series is one hell of a lot of fun. Now, I read the first 4 or 5 books in the series, I think, and it has the same type of humor as the Charlie Davidson novels by Dorinda Jones. So so this reminds me that I need to get back to this series, and I really do want to finish it because it was a lot of fun. So next up is Odd Thomas by Dean Koontz. So I'm not sure where I heard about this book, but I went into it knowing pretty much nothing about it. I was surprised how much I ended up enjoying it. And I think it was probably because I heard somebody talking that it involved a psychic, which caught my attention, so I got it. This follows a young man, a short order cook, who has the ability to see the dead. Now, though the dead are unable to speak, Thomas tries to help them whenever possible, often helping to resolve that which has wronged them in their lives. He can also see what he calls bodaks, I think it was, which are hyena-like shadowy creatures of unknown origins that might be demons or might be something else. So one day a mysterious man shows up in town with a pack of bodaks following him around, and Thomas senses that something is up, that something is not right. And he is correct. And as it turns out, catastrophe is right around the corner. So I really loved this first book, and I was excited to learn it was a series, but the book did not end on a cliffhanger. It was nicely wrapped up at the end. So I picked up the second book in the series, and I have to admit I didn't get on with it at all. So I decided to not continue with the rest of the series. I don't know. I remember thinking that the book was completely boring, and I found myself slogging through it, and I did not love it like I loved the first one. So yes, that was the only book that I read in the series, Odd Thomas. So next book is More Than This by Patrick Ness. So this was another book I saw at the library, and this was my first introduction to Patrick Ness as an author. And this follows a boy named Seth who drowns, and I think he might have committed suicide, though I really can't remember. So he drowns and he wakes up confused. Now he actually remembers dying. He remembers his body getting smashed up against the rocks, but yet here he is. So though the place he finds himself resembles the small English town where he lived as a kid, he discovers that his old neighborhood is completely abandoned and overgrown. Empty. There's no one there but him. So the question is, what happened and where in the hell is he? Or is this hell? If it is, and he truly is dead, then why is he hungry and cold and physically in pain? And thus he begins his search for answers. So I remember that I really loved this book when I read it and was blown away by it. And this book actually ended up leading me into reading other Patrick Ness's books, and I think the first one I read after this one was A Monster Calls. Okay, so the next book is, where am I here? Oh, The Last Vampire by Christopher Pike. So, okay, this book was published in 1994, and it was about that time when I read it. And I actually picked up the first book in a thrift store, knowing nothing about it. You know, I mentioned a few times on this channel that there was a phase I went through when I was really into a vampire kick. So The Last Vampire, this ended up being a 6-book series, and the first book was called The Last Vampire. Well, now it's been repackaged. So the new novel, the first novel in the new series, contains the first 3 books of the original series, which is The Last Vampire, Black Blood, and Red Dice. And the name of this novel is Thirst Number 1. Now, the Thirst Number 2 novel contains the next 3 books in the former series. And there are 3 more books in the new series, Thirst 3, 4, and 5, which are all new stories of which I have not read. I remember at the time that I just inhaled these novels. I couldn't get enough of them. Of course, I did go through that heavy vampire stage that I mentioned. So, The Last Vampire, this particular book, follows Elisa, a 5,000-year-old vampire who believed that she was the last of her kind. Hence the title of the book. But when her creator returns to hunt her, she has to protect herself by befriending a boy named Ray. And if I remember correctly, she ends up going back to high school, hiding among the students. So as we learned, Ray might be her only chance at finding her maker before her maker finds her. But things, of course, get complicated when she begins to fall in love with the human boy. So, and you know, I still think I have that original paperback downstairs in the basement. And yes, I have numerous bookshelves in my basement as well. So someday I might pull that out and give it a reread to see if it has withstood the test of time. So, we're nearing the finish line, only a couple left. So next up is Every Day by David Levithan. So I really enjoyed David Levithan's work, and but I wasn't familiar with this book, which again, I came across at the library. So this follows a main character who is called A, like the letter A, who wakes up every day in the body of a different person. So some days A is a boy, other days A is a girl. And there's never any warning about who it will be or where it will be. But A's gotten pretty much used to it, though he has established some rules for himself. And I wrote them down. Never get too attached, avoid being noticed, and do not interfere. So A's all fine and good, body hopping from one person to another, until one morning he wakes up in the body of a boy named Justin and meets Justin's girlfriend, Rhiannon. From that moment, it appears that the rules no longer apply. And that is all I'm going to say about that. I read the sequel to this as well, and I loved it just as much. And I actually do believe that this will be or has been made into a movie. I'm going to have to look into that because I definitely would love to see the movie. So next up is Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. So the narrator of this story sees a 3-line ad in the newspaper which reads, "Teacher seeks pupil. Must have an earnest desire to save the world. Apply in person." So the narrator, as it turns out, is a man in search of meaning, in search for the truth. So he answers the ad and finds himself alone in an abandoned office with a full-grown gorilla who is nibbling on a branch. "You're the teacher?" he asks the gorilla. "I am the teacher," the gorilla replies. So as it turns out, our gorilla, yes, he can talk, and he possesses immense wisdom and has a story to tell. A story that no human being has ever heard before. And thus begins the adventure of a lifetime for a narrator. So actually my sister's boyfriend was reading this book when I was up there for a visit and gave it to me because I was looking for something to read, and apparently I didn't bring enough books with me. But after reading this, I became an instant fan of Daniel Quinn. So yeah, Ishmael, loved it. So the last book on my Whim list is a book entitled Hounded by Kevin Hearn. So someone in passing mentioned a book series about a young, handsome, immortal druid who battles gods, demons, vampires, witches, and other such creatures, and I knew that I needed to read this series post haste. So this follows Atticus O'Sullivan, the last living druid, who, though he looks to be about 21 years old, is actually 21 centuries old. So in present day, he runs an occult bookshop and shapeshifts in his spare time to hunt with his Irish wolfhound, who he communicates with telepathically. So Atticus possesses a magical sword that a very angry Celtic god wants. The god, in fact, has hounded Atticus for centuries. So now the deity has tracked him down, so Atticus enlists the help of a very colorful cast of characters to save his life. So first off, I love this author's humor, and the storyline is phenomenal. I've read 8 books in this series. There's a total of 9, and I have not yet gotten to the 9th book. I guess I'm kind of sad to see the series end, so I'm prolonging it. But yeah, I fell in love with Atticus and all of the zany characters in the books, which are vampires, werewolves, Norse deities, Celtic deities, and more. But yeah, so I really need to finish that last book. So that first book again was Hounded by Kevin Hearn. And if you like urban fantasy type of books like this, then I highly recommend it. So that is it for, actually there were 15 books that I got on a whim. Yeah, so if you like this video, I'd appreciate it if you would click the like button below and subscribe if you haven't, and then click the bell notification icon so you get notified whenever I release new videos. And that about does it. I will talk to you in the next video. Roger and out. Oh.